Hello. In this video, we will talk about activity-based costing, and how it relates to job costing, which was a previous lesson that we had uh, for this class. Okay. Okay. So please recall plant-wide overhead rate. You remember that we discussed last week. One of the key concepts that we discussed is the concept of the plant-wide overhead rate, or the predetermined overhead rate. So as we can recall, the plant-wide overhead rate is a single overhead rate that is used to apply manufacturing overhead to jobs throughout an entire factory. So what we're doing through the plant-wide overhead rate is that we're accumulating all manufacturing overhead, whether variable or fixed, into one cost pool, and how that cost pool of manufacturing overhead is then applied to different jobs or different products using a predetermined driver, or a predetermined denominator that will be used to apply that cost pool, that single cost pool, to different products. Okay, and as we know, direct labor is one of the usual allocation base used um, for applying overhead to these different jobs. Direct labor hours are usually used because, number one, they are already being recorded. Because as you know, direct labor is part of direct materials, that will form part of the cost of a job or a product. And so therefore, since it's already being recorded, then it won't take much effort to also use it as allocation base. Okay. Second, direct labor is usually a large component of product costs, and therefore might be a good way to um, allocate costs using direct labor. Okay, since if it's a significant component, then most likely overhead will also be um, allocated in such manner. Okay. Also, managers believe that direct labor and overhead costs were highly correlated, you know, being since they are both conversion costs. If you remember, both direct labor and overhead are called conversion costs because they are costs that are used to transform raw materials into finished goods or finished products. And them being both conversion costs, the theory being that they are highly correlated in terms of the actual expenditure. Okay? However, one of the discussions that we had during job costing mentions that plant-wide overhead allocation systems may not be optimal for some companies. Why? Number one, okay, most companies sell a large variety of products that consume differing amounts of overhead. Okay, there might be so many products, you know, that it might be quite obvious that one product uses more overhead than another, even though it uses more labor. Okay, so for, so that's simply the case because of the large variety of products. It's simply possible that overhead and direct labor won't have uh, the same the same direction in terms of usage. Another thing is as a total of percentage of total cost, direct labor has been declining and overhead has been increasing over time. This is due to mechanization, right? As production processes becomes more mechanized, more automated, then the cost of overhead actually is increasing versus direct labor. And so that 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 forwards the case that direct labor might not be the best way to allocate overhead, since direct labor is diminishing as a percentage of total cost of a product, simply because of technological enhancement. Okay. And also, the last point, since we're on the point of technological advancement, since there are already technological advancement, more and more costs become direct. Why? Because it's now easy to track them. Okay, so having advanced enterprise management systems and other IT systems reduce the cost and the complexity of gathering diverse sources of data, and therefore it might be more, might be easier, frankly, to gather data or gather information, okay? And therefore be more precise in terms of overhead allocation. In the last chapter, we also talked about multiple predetermined overhead rates or predetermined overhead rates that's per department. No, this addresses the disadvantage of a single plant-wide overhead rate. Okay, so there can be multiple ones and there's one per department. And in our example last time, that's milling and assembly. So they might have different overhead rates. Okay. Again, the fact is one driver might not be sufficient. For example, for the milling department, and for example, the driver used for that department is direct labor hours. Within the milling department, there could be other activities that are not driven really by number of direct labor hours. But we're just using direct labor hours as a proxy so that we can allocate it and assign it to the products. But their physical flow or physical drivers are not really direct labor hours. So it makes it a little bit adaptive to the needs of having correct costing, but there are still pitfalls. Okay. The idea here is that activity-based costing um, is a solution to this problem, because we will be accumulating costs per activity, and for all of those activity, they might have different drivers. And those drivers will be tallied per product and will be used to allocate those specific activities. Okay? Here we are recognizing that not all overhead can be characterized that it's driven by direct labor hours or machine hours. Okay? Because simply put, there might be other drivers that drive their uh, their cost movement or cost increase or cost behavior. Okay? Now we introduce ourselves to activity-based costing. So what's activity-based costing? It is a technique that attempts to assign overhead cost more accurately to products, and it accumulates costs on a per activity basis. Okay? And those activities, each product will be monitored with respect to that activity. And therefore, there will be multiple allocations for one product, depending on the driver per activity. Okay? So the idea here is that cost objects are driven by activities. How you produce a cost object, a product, for example, it's driven by multiple activities. Okay? And those activities consume resources and therefore drives costs. Okay? So here we recognize that the production of one product, let's say you're producing laptops. When you produce one laptop, the actual production is not the only activity related to the production of that laptop. Okay? There are other activities which has costs, which can be traceable to that one laptop that you produced. Okay? What are some examples of activities that are not usually thought about? Okay? Number one, setting up of machines or batch or production setup. Okay? When you set up a production line, there are fixed costs related to it. Okay? Pag pinatay mo yung production line, when you restart it again for the next production run, there are costs related to it, related to maintenance, making sure that it all greased up. There are test runs. Those are fixed costs. And those costs are overhead costs. And therefore, every time that you set up machines for production, no, that's one driver. That's one activity that has a driver, that has a separate cost driver, rather than direct labor hours for number of units produced. Because if it's one continuous production run, it's only one setup time or setup cost. No, but if you are producing the same amount pero tatlong production runs, it means thrice ang setup costs mo. So the driver there is different. Diba? The direct labor hours might be the same for those two scenarios, but the setup times, the setup costs are different. Okay? Another example of activity is billing of customers. Okay? The costs related to billing are not necessarily related to production, right? If you have 10,000 units sold, but you sold it to, but you have only 7,000 customers, and therefore you only have 7,000 bills to send. And therefore the costs related to billing are not really based on 10,000 units, but it's based on 7,000 bills. Okay, so you see the idea? The idea is we're trying to identify activities that are essential for costing purposes. And then for each unit of a product, we tag how many of the cost drivers of these activities are used, so that we can assign the cost of these activities to the product. Okay. Some definitions. Okay. So the activity cost pool is the cost bucket in which costs related to a particular activity are accumulated. So ito yung sinasabi kaninang billing, setting up costs, admission, etc. Those are the activities and those are the activity cost pools. Okay? So once a cost is incurred, doon yan pinapasok sa mga cost pool. Okay? Activity measure, on the other hand, is the driver of the activity. It expresses how much of the activity is carried out. Okay? And the activity rate is, of course, activity cost pool divided by the activity measure, which is the predetermined overhead rate for each activity in the cost pool. Okay? So the key here is that a predetermined overhead rate is computed for each activity. Okay? And then you apply it to the products for each activity. Okay? So what's different is that is a plant-wide overhead. Lahat ng overhead na-accumulate natin into one cost pool and we apply it based on one activity rate. Right? But right now, what's different is we will now accumulate those overhead into different activity pools, multiple activity pools. And each of those activity pool has a rate that will be used to apply for the cost for the specific product. Okay? So it's the same principle actually. It's the same procedures, it's the same principle. Ang iba lang is rather than accumulate it into one, we accumulate it into multiple buckets. And those buckets will be applied to the products based on the drivers for each bucket. Okay? What are some examples of activities or hierarchy of activities? There are usually four hierarchies of activities when we talk about activity-based costing. Unit level, batch level, product level, and facility level. Okay? So when we talk about unit level activities, these are activities that are tagged to specific units produced. Okay? Example are those three. When you process units on machines, no, then that's an activity, processing time, no, in terms of using machines. So the measure there is machine hours. No, processing units by hand or labor hours and consuming factory supplies. Contrast that against batch level, which is tagged to the number of production batches and not units produced. Okay? So pag batch level yan, it means that if you are producing 1,000 units this month, and you are producing those 1,000 units in terms of two production runs, ibig sabihin, dalawang tig 500 ang gagawin mo, that means that there will be two batches. And there are costs that are incurred at the batch level. What are those activities? No? The most obvious is setting up of equipment. Right? If there will be two production runs, you know, therefore there will be two batches, two setting ups of equipment, and therefore it will be two batches, two setups. Okay? What are some other activities at the batch level? Processing of purchase orders, processing of production orders. They are not really related to specific units, but specific production runs, right? You purchase raw materials for one production run. Okay, so that's why it's called the batch level activity. So that could be also another unit of activity cost pool. Third, product level, tagged to the number of products rather than units produced, meaning the costs at the product level increases as the number of products increase. For example, testing new products. Eh, natural, kung mas maraming products, there will be more testing. So it's independent of the number of batches produced. It's also independent of number of units produced, right? Because if you have only one product, testing new products, therefore, is konti lang. Diba? The cost of testing new products is not really dependent on the number of batches that you produce or number of units that you produce, right? Because it's not related to the production. It's related to the number of products you have. Right? And last is facility level, so general factory administration, plant building, and ground maintenance. No? Ang driver niya is number of facilities that you have. If you have only one facility, then the costs remain the same, regardless of how many products you have, regardless of how many production batches you do, or number of units that you produce. The point here is that at each of these levels, the drivers of the costs may be different, right? And so therefore, activity-based costing recognizes the fact that the drivers for each of these activities might be different. And therefore, we have to allocate them differently and not in the same level or the same overhead. Okay. Okay. So an example is that at the first stage cost assignment, total manufacturing cost will be assigned to different cost pools of activities. So yung labor-related pool, machine-related pool, kumbaga, the total manufacturing overhead that you have to be able to identify whether that is related to activity A, B, C, and D. Once you have identified the amounts for activity A, B, C, and D, there's a second stage allocation. Okay? And what's the second stage allocation? We now determine the drivers consumed for each activity, and it is now um, incorporated in the on how product costs are determined. Okay, so this is an example. So Volty Inc. uses activity-based costing, and they have identified 4 manufacturing activities. So based on their study of how they work, there are 4 main manufacturing activities: materials handling, machine setup, insertion of parts, and finishing. Okay? And for each of those activities, they have budgeted the costs for 2018 related to those activities. And the annual budgeted costs are for materials handling, $15,000, $6,000 for machine setup, $60,000 for insertion of parts, and $90,000 for finishing. The fact that they were able to tag the total 171,000 to each of these activities, that's the first level assignment. Okay? That's the first stage cost assignment. Okay? I was able to break 170,000 into these activities. Okay? And that's the first stage cost assignment. Okay? And they when they made this budget, okay, they were expecting to produce 800 chrome bumpers during the year. And the bumpers, those 800 bumpers, is expected to use 6,000 parts. They require 15 setups, consume 1,002 hours of finishing time. Okay, so here you can see that the allocation base is there, and the budgeted consumption of each of those activities for the year are provided. And from there, you know that we are now able to determine the predetermined overhead rate for each activity, right? How do we do that? Then each of the budgeted costs in total will have to be divided by their estimated consumption for the year. Okay? And that's what we do in the next slide. So here we have to determine the predetermined overhead rate for each activity. How do you do that? So how do you do that? These are the activities, these are the costs, and these are the allocation days. Sabi sa previous slide, it, we will use 6,000 parts for the whole year, and the total cost of materials handling is 15,000. And so therefore, to determine the predetermined overhead rate for that is this. Okay? So total estimated overhead cost for that activity is 15,000 divided by the estimated quantity of the overhead allocation days, which is 6,000. And therefore, the predetermined overhead rate is 1250 per part. Okay? And that's for materials handling. And you do so for the rest of the other parts. Okay? So for machine setup, the budgeted cost for the year is 6,000. Okay? And the budgeted number of setups for the year is 15. And therefore, the predetermined overhead rate for that activity is $400 per setup. Okay? For insertion of parts, the total cost is 60,000 and they are using 6,000 parts. And so therefore, the predetermined overhead rate is $10 per part. And last, for finishing, the estimate is 90,000 for finishing here. Okay? And the denominator is the finishing direct labor hours, which is 1,200. And therefore, the rate is $75 per hour. Okay? So if you look at the procedure, it's really the same as job costing, right? Ang naiba lang is rather than accumulating them into one pool, total overhead is broken down into different pools. Okay? And each of those different pools might have a different cost driver. And therefore, you determine or you compute the predetermined overhead based on the planned cost drivers. Okay? So, given that you know already the predetermined overhead rate, you were told that Volty produced 780 chrome bumpers for the whole year, and they used the following. This was the actual usage, no, in producing 780 units. You are now asked to determine the cost per product. Okay? Cost per product meaning cost per chrome bumper, given that this is the actual consumption for the year. Determine that. So this is the predetermined allocation overhead rate for each of the activity. You know the actual usage per activity, so it's just simply multiplying. For materials handling, the rate is 250 per part. Sorry, that's because of me. Per part. And there are 6,060 parts used, and therefore multiplying, this is the applied overhead. Okay, and so on. 400 per setup, and there were only 12 setups rather than 15. So for it, $10 per part, and there were 6,060 parts. So that's the cost. There were 75. The predetermined overhead rate is 75 per finishing hour, and there were 1,000 finishing direct labor hours. And so therefore, the total cost, total manufacturing overhead, is 155,500. Okay, and the number of units produced was 780, and therefore the overhead cost per unit is 199.40. Remember, this is only overhead. There's no direct materials and direct labor. So the overhead costs per unit is 199.40. So you see how it works is that it's very similar to job costing. No? The procedures was a little bit different because you have multiple cost pools, and you have You have multiple cost pools here, and you have multiple activities to track. Essentially, it's the same principle as job costing. Okay? So, why do we use activity-based management? It's to target process improvements. No? An activity-based costing system can help identify areas where the company can benefit from improving its current processes. Under the single predetermined overhead rate methodology in job costing, it's difficult to push for improvements because you have only one rate that you are looking at, right? So it's difficult to monitor which activity is being overspent or not. But with activity-based costing, you know for a fact that you can monitor the different activities that drive the overhead costs of products. And therefore, it's easier to target process improvements. Okay, so that's why here, um, what we can do is that activity rates can be used to target areas where costs seem excessively high because you know the activity rate for activity. So therefore, it's easier to monitor them, easier to improve them, easier to compare whether usage is deteriorating or not. Um, what are the benefits of the activity-based costing system? Of course, it improves the accuracy of product costing. Okay? Because you're able to effectively tag the activity to the cost driver. Okay? Yun naman sa job costing, yung single predetermined overhead rate, that's a simplified way of applying overhead. Not all items of overhead will be captured or is really driven by direct labor hours. Right? So by using activity-based costing, you can really track each activity and how it is being spent. Okay? So increasing the number of cost pools used to accumulate overhead costs, when you increase the number of cost pools, you can monitor these costs better. Using activity cost pools that are more homogeneous than departmental cost pools, because if they're more homogeneous, it means there can be more um, uh, better way of predicting those costs because they have the same cost drivers. And if it's easier to predict those costs, then it improves your financial planning activities. Okay. Assigning overhead costs using activity measures that cause those costs rather than relying solely on direct labor costs. That's what I've been saying. Because the costing of products become more accurate because we are really assigning a cost driver for each cost. Lastly, a limitation of activity-based costing, of course, is that it can be expensive to implement because you have to monitor a lot of things, and therefore you have to have an accounting system or a uh, enterprise production management system that would be able to keep track of all of those things. So the costs may outweigh the benefits. However, benefits are more likely to outweigh costs when, number one, when the products are substantially different in terms of volume, batch size, and activities required. Kasi kung if they are substantially different, then more likely they don't have the same cost driver. Okay? Conditions have changed substantially since the existing costing system was established. Overhead costs are high and increasing. If overhead costs are high and increasing, then it might be worth it to invest in a system that would allow you to monitor overhead more effectively. Okay, so those are some instances where more likely the benefits will outweigh the risks or the costs related to this cost. That's it. Thank you for listening.